بر محمد و آل محمد صلوات. اندھیرے اندھیرے یتیموں سے چھپ کر سر قبر زہرا علی رو رہے ہیں. اندھیرے اندھیرے یتیموں سے چھپ کر سر قبر زہرا علی رو رہے ہیں. تمہاری مصیبت بلاؤں گا کیسے میں بچوں سے آنسو چھپاؤں گا کیسے. تمہاری مصیبت بلاؤں گا کیسے میں بچوں سے آنسو چھپاؤں گا کیسے. تمہیں یاد کر کے جو روئیں گے بچے میں بچوں کو کیسے مناؤں گا کیسے. تصور میں زہرا سے کر کے یہ باتیں جھکائے سر اپنا علی رو رہے ہیں. جھکائے سر اپنا علی رو رہے ہیں. اندھیرے اندھیرے یتیموں سے چھپ کر سر قبر زہرا علی رو رہے ہیں. کبھی آنسوؤں کو چھپاتی ہے زینب کبھی بھائیوں کو اٹھاتی ہے زینب. کبھی گھر کے آنگن میں آتی ہے زینب کبھی ماں کے حجرے میں جاتی ہے زینب. کبھی آ کے فضا سے کہتی ہے زینب علی رو رہے ہیں. اندھیرے اندھیرے یتیموں سے چھپ کر سر قبر زہرا علی رو رہے ہیں. اندھیرے اندھیرے مومنو مقتل زہرا کی یہ روداد سنو کی ہے امت نے مصیبت میں جو بیداد سنو. مصطفیٰ مارے گئے گر ہوا برباد سنو. باپ کو روتی ہوئی بیٹی کی فریاد سنو. اس کو رو لو جسے اس کو رو لو جسے رونے کا اجازہ نہ دیا. کہ امت نے جسے کا پرسہ نہ دیا، باپ کے غم میں تھی غمگین نبی کی بیٹی، غش پہ غش کھاتے تھے فرقت میں پیمبر کی علی، روتی حسنین کو لپٹا کے تھی زہرا بی بی، خشک نہ قبر پیمبر کی ہوئی تھی مٹی، شرم سرور کے یتیموں سے نائی کھا کر، آگ دروازے پہ امت نے لگائی آ کر، بولی دروازے کے پیچھے سے یہ آ کر زہرا، کیوں مسلمانوں کیا ہے میرے گھر پر حملہ، ان کی بیٹی ہوں کہ تم پڑھتے ہو جن کا کلمہ، اپنے بابا سے میں فریاد کروں گی للہ، ہم ستائے ہوں کو اور ستاتے کیوں ہو، یہ تو بتلاؤ میرے گھر کو جلاتے کیوں ہو، ایک لائی بولا کہ حیدر کو نکالو باہر، ورنہ جاؤں گا بن پوچھے میں گھر کے اندر، سن کے رونے لگی یہ بات نبی کی دختر، لات دروازے پہ ایک ماری لائنے بر کر، آ کے پہلو پا وہ جلتا ہوا دروازہ گرا، بیچ میں تھی در و دیوار کہ ہائے زہرا، جلتے دروازے کے اوپر سے مسلمان گزرے، اور تھی فاطمہ زہرا اسی در کے نیچے، شور کرتے ہوئے گھر میں جو لیا پہنچے، دیکھ کر بلوے کو روتے تھے علی کے بچے، در کو اماں سے ہٹاتی ہے پریشان زینب، ہے مدینے میں بھی یہ شان میں غریبہ زینب، تھی بہت صابرہ پر بنت نبی چیخ اٹھی، کھیل جلتے ہوئے دروازے کی پہلو میں لگی، قتل محسن ہوئے اور ساتھ میں ٹوٹی پسلی، عرش ترانے لگا زہرا کی یوں گود اجری، تھام لو کے ذرا मुझको ये ज़हरा ने कहा, हाय फिजा मेरा बच्चा मेरा मोहसिन न रहा। दोरी हुजरे की तरफ दर को हटा कर ज़हरा, ताज़ियाना जो अली के लिए उठता देखा, अपने बाजू पर उसे ज़हरा ने बर कर रोका, और गज़ब उस पर भी कुनफुज़ ने तमाचा मारा। बांधी गर्दन में रसन करके गिरफ्तार लाई, ले गए हैदर कर्रार को दरबार लाई, ले गए हैदर कर्रार को दरबार लाई। बर मोहम्मद व आल मोहम्मद सल्लल्लाहु।
Respected elders, sisters and brothers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Inshallah, tonight we have two speakers from the ladies' side within our own community. We have Sister Zamina Mithani. Sister Zamina Mithani is a medical student at the University of British Columbia with a prior master's degree in medical ethics. She has lived in Vancouver all her life and is humbled to be able to recite for her community. And our second speaker tonight, inshallah, is Sister Sayyida Sana Az-Zahraa. Sister Sayyida Sana Az-Zahraa migrated to Canada in 2018. She is the granddaughter of Maulana Sayyid Amir Hussain Naqvi, who was the resident alim of Az-Zahraa Richmond Center in 1979 and a profound international scholar. She is an HR graduate from SFU and a CPHR candidate. She has been a public speaker for many years. Sana has been actively speaking at many religious, social, educational gatherings in Pakistan, Toronto, and Vancouver. Her main areas of interest are the implementation of Islam in our lives, teaching youth how to have balance between deen and dunya, women empowerment, community building, and organizational skills. She believes in uplifting others and helping people grow. I'll hand over the program to the ladies' side, who will have the speakers recite, inshallah. Muhammad wa ala Muhammad salawat.
Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Praise and blessings be upon Muhammad al-Mustafa, the best of all prophets, a mercy upon mankind and his holy progeny, with your loudest of salawats. Assalamu alayki ya binti Rasulullah ya Fatima Az-Zahraa. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaykum, my wonderful community. Bibi Fatima alayhi salam is not only a role model for both men and women, but the peak of manifesting the names of God. In Hadith Qissa, the entire culmination of prophethood and imamat is summarized through her relationality when we say Hum Fatimatu wa abuha wa ba'aluha wa banuha. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. That this is Fatima, her father, her husband, and her sons. We might even go farther when we remember the hadith of the Prophet who said that Fatima is part of me, bad'atum minni. So she is not only intrinsically bound to the institutions of prophethood and imamat through lineage and kinship, but she is part of Rasulullah himself. She is part of that divine light. We also know that Bibi Fatima alayhi salam has lived a very deeply traumatic life. From the early death of her mother, the death of her father, and the inability to properly mourn for him, up until the events of Fadak and the breaking down of the door, the miscarriage, and being a mother who not only witnessed her children and her husband's disrespect in this world, but who had that secret knowledge of how her son Al-Hussein would be brutally massacred in the future. When we piece together the narratives of Fatima, we focus, especially in this ayyam, on this trauma. Indeed, what makes the Shia faith so rich is that we come together for this process of collective grieving. It is this act of grieving for something greater than our own trials and deeper than our own sorrows of this world that makes gatherings like this revolutionary and places where we can increase our devotion to this lady. While Bibi Fatima alayhi salam had multiple attributes, today I want to focus on her compassion. Compassion is not just sympathy, where we feel bad for someone but don't really appreciate their struggle. Nor is it a kind of transactional kindness where we expect something in return for being good to someone. Lady Fatima alayhi salam taught us that compassion is a radical act. It is a radical act of three things that I'm going to discuss today. It's a radical act of number 1, worship, number 2, service, and number 3, leadership. She also taught us that care and kindness is not just something feminine, but something of strength, which she explores in her sermon of Fadak, in arguably one of the most traumatic and darkest times of her life. So number 1, first, Bibi Fatima alayhi salam demonstrates compassion as a radical act of worship. We all know this narration from Imam Hassan alayhi salam, who said that one night and many nights I saw my mother Fatima alayhi salam in her mihrab bow and prostrate and offer prayers until the light of the morning appeared. I heard her praying to Allah for the believing men and the believing women and mentioning them by name. She prayed to Allah for them so much, but without praying for herself. So I said to her one day, "Why don't you pray to Allah for yourself, O mother?" And she said to him, "O Hassan, O my son, we pray for the neighbor first and then our house." So we all know this story. Bibi Fatima alayhi salam prayed for her neighbors first and then her own family, then her own self. And one way to look at this is to acknowledge that when we pray for others, we know that Allah accepts our own hajat and our own wishes. And this is totally true. There are many, many narrations to support this. And in fact, it's also one of the etiquettes of when you go to a place like ziyarah, you go there, you should pray for someone else first. You should pray for others first before your own, whole laundry list of wishes comes out. But another way to look at this hadith is that Bibi Fatima alayhi salam is trying to teach us about a collective salvation. That is, when all of us do well and all of us are guided, this fulfills the goals of the ummah getting towards God. And if that's the goal, Bibi Fatima's prayer here is an act of leadership and example for us. Her care for others is not just for the sake of others, but as a demonstration of how when we break our egos and pray for others genuinely and sincerely for the sake of God, this is a very sincere act of worship. And this is an act of worship, in fact, where we reflect the names of Allah, Ar-Rahman, the Merciful. Praying for others shouldn't be a means to our own end, for our own du'as, or we shouldn't pray for those who we think only they deserve our prayers or they need our prayers, or maybe they ask us for our prayers. But we become Rahman when we pray for our community without being asked. So I challenge you now to look around you, look around your congregation, look around you in this room, and pick someone in the audience to pray for. You don't have to tell them, just look around, make eye contact or don't make eye contact with someone, and just have them in the back of your mind. And we're going to return to this at the end of the speech. So number 2, let's take it up a notch. Bibi Fatima alayhi salam demonstrates compassion as a radical act of service. So we all know this verse of the Holy Quran, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, وَيُطْعِمُونَ الطَّعَامَ عَلَى حُبِّهِ مِسْكِينًا وَيَتِيمًا وَأَسِيرًا. Yes, okay. So they give out food out of love for him to the poor, the orphan, and the captive. And we only feed you for Allah's sake, and we desire from you neither reward nor thanks. And we know this verse was revealed with this narration that Bibi Fatima alayhi salam and her family were keeping a promise to fast for 3 days when Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein alayhi salam were sick. And we know that every day they just decided to fast, they had 1 loaf of bread to break their fast with. And every day that they wanted to break their fast, to have that iftar, someone came to their house who had a need, a poor person, an orphan, and someone who had recently been freed. And every day they gave away their loaves of bread without being asked, without it being witnessed, in fact, and just drank some water to break that fast. So we know this narration of Bibi Fatima, but how often do we actually practice this ourselves? We just give when it benefits us, when there's something for us to be gained by it. And in this narration, what we don't realize is no one is seeing her give away these loaves of bread or seeing her family give away these loaves of bread every night. These are completely unwitnessed acts. In fact, the only reason we have this narration is because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran this is what happens. He brings light and dignity and witness to it. And yet here we are. We let other people guide our goodness, and we let other people tell us, what makes us good and what makes us bad, what makes our actions moral, what makes our actions good. Imam Baqir alayhi salam has a, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, has a narration where he told one of his companions, and I'm going to paraphrase here, but he said that a friend of ours is someone who, if people were to band together and were to say you're a bad person, it would not worry them. And if they got together and said that you're a good person, it wouldn't make them any happier. So as a, sort of summary of this hadith, if everyone in the mosque right now were to throw you a party, saying you're the most religious person, the number one human, like the number one, person in the mosque, that shouldn't make you any happier about yourself or give you any increased self-fulfillment of the moral action you've done. A true believer, according to this hadith, is someone who derives satisfaction knowing that they are on the truth and knowing that they believe in God, and they don't need other people to tell them that they are good or that they are bad. This idea of private acts of service that Bibi Fatima alayhi salam, demonstrates to us in an independent sense of knowing if what we are doing is for God and for God alone is so, so important. And it's reinforced in the lines of Dua Makarim al-Akhlaq, where Imam Zain al-Abidin says, "Raise me not a single degree before people without lowering me in its like of myself." And it also says, "Let good flow out from my hands upon the people, and do not efface it or do not sort of degrade it without making them feel by making them feel obliged, by making them feel like they owe me something." So this is Bibi Fatima and her compassion, showing us how it can be a radical act of service. So let's take it up even further. Number 3, Bibi Fatima showing us that compassion is a radical act of leadership. A radical act of leadership. It is not just praying for people. It is not just acts of service. It is all of those things. But compassion, as shown by Bibi Fatima, is also at the heart of wilaya and how the A'imma led their people. We see this now in the sermon of Fadak, when Bibi Fatima, at a certain point in the sermon, presents a very powerful metaphor to describe leadership. She does this through the metaphor of a camel representing the Khilafah. So she tells Abu Bakr here, she says, "You have branded a camel that does not belong to you and that you are not equipped to ride." As in, this is the wrongfully taken Khilafah. As a result, you will injure the nostrils of the beast and it will drive you to a null destination. So again, this is what many people believe is a metaphor for the Khilafah, which had been taken unjustly. So then she continues to say, we, the Ahlul Bayt, on the other hand, would have led the camel and the caravan at a pace that would not wear out the animals nor the people. And we would have guided the masses secretly and openly until they arrived at their best destinations. And then after, in sheer frustration, she says, so take its reins, the reins of the camel or the reins of Khilafah, and saddle it with its sore back and tired hooves, ever disgraceful, branded with the wrath of God and eternal dishonor. So in this portion of the speech of Fadak, according to Dr. Mahjab bin Dala, Bibi Fatima frames leadership here, through this metaphor of the Khilafah and the camel, not as an act of control and power, which the other caliphs did, but as an act of care and compassion. So with this metaphor, she says she would have led the Ummah, the Aimma, the Ahlul Bayt would have led the Ummah at a pace that would not wear them out. There's care there, there's compassion there. And they would have guided the masses secretly and openly until they arrived at their best destinations. And there are multiple modern theologians and ethicists who describe leadership through a model of the ethics of care, this idea that we can be compassionate in how we lead people, where it isn't money or power or rhetoric, but our deep concern for the welfare of others for the sake of God and for God alone. But instead, us and our acts of compassion are always, sort of guided by ulterior motives and by a love of this world, not for a love of God. And sometimes we even go a step further and we convince ourselves it's for God, but there are other variables in there that kind of matter more to us. Status in the community, what our friends are doing, even how charity and philanthropy can inflate our own sense of ego instead of breaking it down. We even have capitalist structures that profit off of this desire for us to feel good doing good things for others. An example of this is the industry of voluntourism, a term for volunteer tourism where, other people go to other countries to help people without really understanding if we're just helping them or if we're just paying for an experience where we think they are. I don't have a lot of time to discuss this, but there's a great CBC documentary for those who are interested in learning more. So through these examples, I hope I have argued that compassion, as taught to us by Lady Fatima, is a radical act of three things: of worship, of service, and of leadership. It is not something that shows weakness, it is not something that takes away from us, and it is not a passive act. Rather, our ability as a community to be unreservedly kind to each other demonstrates that we are trying to break down our own independent sense of self and our egos and become more godly in our attributes, become like the Ar-Rahman, becoming more giving, more merciful, and more gentle. It also shows us that power in the eyes of the Aimma, whose place was stolen from them for centuries and centuries by different caliphs, is not this, unilateral brute force kind of entity, but the ability to change the mentality of a community from thinking selfishly to thinking selflessly, and from worrying about what people think of them, and instead worrying about the hereafter, which is our permanent life. So now I want you to remember what I told you earlier about the person you spotted in the audience. And I take this time at my end of the speech to ask you now to pray for this person who you saw. Maybe someone who's never talked to you, maybe someone who's never asked you to pray for them. Pray for their success and wellness in a pursuit of a life like Bibi Fatima's alayhi salam. And if you know this person who you spotted, remember their good attributes and ask for Allah to increase those attributes in them. And pray for everyone in this jama'ah, everyone in this congregation the same. I also ask for you to pray for the marhumeen of my family, Marhum Hussein Mithani, from Marhum Murtaza Bahosh Jafar, and all the marhumeen of the people here today. On behalf of Lady Zahra alayhi salam, I also ask for you to pray for the young women of our community, and the mothers, and all of those who are silently suffering. On behalf of the trials of Bibi Fatima, and that door that was upon the chest of the Lady Fatima, I pray for my mothers and my sisters. May you seek your shafa and your healing through the tawassul of this great lady. By Muhammad wa ali Muhammad salawat.
Thank you, Zamina. Thank you, Zamina. That was most powerful. Thank you so much. May I have a salawat for Zamina? Allah. Okay, so now we could have you come here. Thank you. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
بر محمد و آل محمد بلندتر صلوات. In the name of Allah, the most beneficent and the most merciful. Today, I'm honored to speak in praise of one of the greatest women in the history. I'd like to start my speech with one of the beautiful sayings by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. Salli ala Muhammad wa ali. The Prophet said, of all the women in the universe, 4 would suffice: Mary, Asiya, Khadija, and Fatima. Several times in the history, it has been proven how all these women were the women of virtues and high moral standards. Mary, venerated as a righteous woman and the only woman mentioned by the name in the Quran. The 19th surah of the Quran is named after her, and she is mentioned more times in the Quran than in the entire New Testament. The Quran further mentions the qualities of Maryam, declaring her to be a sign of God to mankind, as one who guarded her chastity, an obedient one, a chosen one, a purified one, and a truthful one. Asiya, who attained perfect faith as described by the Prophet. She lived in ancient Egypt during the rule of the most oppressive tyrant in history, who claims to be all-powerful God, and he made his people worship him. Not only did she live under his rule, but she lived in his home as his wife. A woman who, with the help of Allah, was chosen to nurture and protect the Prophet of that time. A woman who stood in defense of her faith and made it clear that no relation is above the love of God. Khadija salamullah alayha, who despite being a known and successful businesswoman, stood with the Prophet Muhammad in all his tough times. She gave up everything she had for the love of God and stayed obedient to the God and his Prophet. She stayed with the Prophet for 3 years in Shaybi Abi Talib, after the polytheists of Mecca declared an economic and social boycott on them. They faced hunger, a ban on trading, and having social interactions with other Muslims, but she never left the righteous path. And this lady gave birth to the most obedient daughter, named as Fatima, who was an honor for Islam and also for the Islamic Ummah. And here, it only befits to say that Sayyida Zahra is the possessor of all the qualities these women had and more. The position of Fatima Az-Zahra is one of the positions that are either impossible or difficult for ordinary people like you and I to image. After all, she was infallible. Formally, she was neither a prophet nor an imam, but in terms of her position, she was at the level of a prophet or an imam. That is why the infallible imams used to mention the holy name of Fatima Az-Zahra with a lot of respect. This is who Fatima Az-Zahra was. She was a woman of great virtues and values. Although it is generally assumed that family lineage is kept alive through the male gender, but in Islam, infallibility and leadership have been transferred from the Prophet through Lady Fatima. Before the advent of Islam, when a daughter was born in the land of Arabs, it was considered a shameful act for the parents. Women were buried alive and were treated as slaves in their houses and held no rights to take actions or decisions in any matter of the life. But Islam made it clear that every woman has rights and laws. This is why history still looks in amazement at the way Prophet Muhammad behaved towards his young daughter Fatima, the way he spoke to her, and the way he praised her. Sayyidah Fatima was the greatest lady in humanity. She was the perfect example of how a daughter, a wife, and a mother should act. She also showed us the Muslim woman's role in the social field within the limits of religion and virtue. Her noble life confirmed that Islam does not deprive women of acquiring scientific, cultural, and literary knowledge. Now let's do a detailed analysis of Sayyidah Fatima's life and see how we can learn from it. If Lady Fatima is Qawsar, meaning abundance, as is understood from the 108th chapter of the Holy Quran, it is because her level of knowledge and understanding is like a bubbling spring, continuously overflowing and quenching the thirst of the people throughout the history. This phrase is most definitely true about Lady Fatima. She was a learned person who had not been taught, and therefore her knowledge must have been God-given. In the traditions and narrations, she has been named the learned lady, Muhaddisa, and it has been reported that the angels would converse with her. They would tell her about the future events, and she would dictate it to Imam Ali, who would take note of the information. Thus, she most definitely had the status of a learned person who had not been taught. And she had the highest level of knowledge and infallibility compared to other great female figures. The writers of her history narrated that she used to teach lessons to the women of the migrants and supporters who used to gather for her teaching lessons, rather as pupils assemble for the lessons given in the religious school as we know today. Her sermon in the mosque, in which she explained the secrets of jurisprudence and divine laws, as well as other points, is a living document and the best testimony of Fatima's cultural message and her educational and intellectual responsibility. Fatima did not live a life in seclusion. Rather, her short life was filled with the wonderful holy struggle on all fronts, and that she lived for Allah and His way to implement the truth. She was an excellent and eloquent orator who always spoke for the truth. Not only this, she also was the pioneer in the political role of the women. She was the person who practiced political work in the strongest manner. She stood alone in front of a new ruling power. She was alone in the mosque. She was alone with the women of Muhajirun and Ansar. And she was alone in the Medina arena that legitimizes Muslim women's participation in politics as an orator, as a dynamic force of opposition, with all the effort and energy that the role would call for. One can easily appreciate from the historical records as to how she performed different duties towards the members of the society she was living in at that time. She was seen giving away her own marriage dress, jewelry, food, and other material possessions to the needy Muslim whenever required. Not only towards Muslims, but she also performed her similar role as a helper and supporter whenever required towards the followers of other religions. She fulfilled her social responsibilities to the utmost level of self-sacrifice, and not seeking any thanks or returns, only as a duty toward God and His religion. History tells us that Fatima lived with her husband as best as a wife can, in love, faithfulness, obedience, and care. She used to take care of her husband, who was burdened with war and his responsibilities, but she never complained about that. Ali and Fatima used to divide the responsibilities inside the house. In our narrations, Fatima asked the Prophet in a loving way to divide the chores between her and Ali. The agreement was that Fatima would grind, knead, and bake, and Ali would sweep the floor and bring water and wood. In this, there's a lesson for men. Men should not learn to feel too grand to serve at home. Ali swept the floor and brought the water and wood, while the men among us feel their masculinity is brought into question if they help in household chores. Ali was the master of men, but saw nothing objectionable in sweeping the floor of the house, because the house was his house and the wife his wife. He was a human being and she was a human being. And a man, however great, is never too big to serve his children, wife, father, mother, brothers, and sister, or anyone for whom he is responsible. Fatima's married life was smooth and simple. She was a wonderful, generous lady. She was known for her piety and generosity. She was a close and sincere friend to her husband and a partner in performing her duties, not only towards him, but also towards the Muslims. Her role as a mother can be seen in the light of the upbringing of her children, Imam Hassan, Imam Hussein, and Sayyidah Zainab. These children were brought up in such a manner by her that reflected high level of moral, intellectual, and spiritual indoctrination. Truly, Fatima was a great mentor for her children. She had a strong relationship with God and His Prophet. Her total submission to and merger in Islam and its divine values, her intimate and strong relationship with God, and her nearness to Him was extraordinary. This relationship of Hazrat Fatima Az-Zahraa with God is partly reflected in her dua an-Nur. Despite her responsibilities toward her marriage, she was also well-focused and nurturing towards her father, even after getting married. She was always there for her father whenever he needed her. She could not survive after the Prophet's death for long. According to several resources, Hazrat Fatima was martyred as a result of injuries sustained when her house was attacked and burned. She died between 75 to 95 days after the demise of the Prophet Muhammad. And according to many Muslim historians and scholars, Fatima asked Ali to bury her at night to ensure none of her enemies participated in her funeral. Here I'd like to conclude my speech that hearing the stereotypes of Muslim women as passive, weak, and oppressed is disappointing. Not to mention flat out wrong, because when we think of Muslim women, we only remember strong, powerful, and selfless individuals of that present and past, who had such an amazing hold on their lives, responsibilities, and faith that we cannot help but be inspired by them and in awe of them. Setting Hazrat Fatima Az-Zahraa as a role model, a woman can perform all these roles under different circumstances. Whether the society is at peace or at war, whether there is an economic or material hardship, or whether members of society are hostile, or whether support from creators is lost, and when the only hope is with God, the Almighty. O Allah, make the blessings of Fatima Az-Zahraa permanent for us, our society, and our hearts. O Allah, do not separate us from the Holy Prophet's household, neither in this world nor in the hereafter. O God, include us among the people who benefit from the prayer of the Imam of the age. Salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.